Let's talk persistent identifiers. You may be familiar with a DOI for an article or a dataset, or with ORCID IDs for a person. Resolve one of these identifiers and you get useful metadata about the item. For a dataset, this metadata might tell you who created it, where is the data housed, were any papers published based on this data? Great stuff. But this one item, described by this one persistent identifier, actually exists in its own unique contextual web, not in a vacuum. It's part of an entire ecosystem of data, papers, people, institutions, samples, instruments, and a whole host of other stuff that makes research work. Wouldn't it be great to be able to ask questions and get answers about not only this object, but its relationship to the broader research landscape? The EU-funded FREYA project is a collaboration between several organizations that are very interested in building and exposing this broader web of persistent identifiers and the things they describe. For this, we are developing the paradigm of the PID graph. The PID graph will bring together and expose the relationships between different kinds of research objects in a machine-readable way, allowing for the automated gathering of richer data and informational analysis. But what do we mean when we say graph? When we talk about a graph, we're not talking about a visualization. We're talking about a mapping of relationships. Take, for example, a social network. Jenny knows Jack and Marcy, who in turn know Jan and Beth and Rachel. While their relationships are largely conceptual, it can still help them get stuff done. When Jenny wants to paint her house, Jack might not be able to help, but he knows a guy. It's the same with research objects. This dataset was created by these people who wrote these papers and worked at this institution. Knowing the social network the data lives in lets us ask richer and more powerful questions. How many other datasets were produced by the same institution? Did the data that came from this facility influence any other published work? But if the PID graph is just conceptual, how do we actually use this information? Persistent identifiers like DOIs, ORCID IDs, and ROR IDs point to the metadata for an object. By specifying within that metadata which other persistent identifiers that object is related to, we build a trail of connections that both humans and machines can follow. This interconnected web of digital objects and their relations is the PID graph and helps provide a broader view of the research, data, researchers, and how they interact and are being utilized. Part of the work of the FREYA project so far has been to ensure that the metadata can accommodate the addition of these connections. But even when the metadata is all accounted for, and the conceptual links of the PID graph are there, it can still be tedious to get these relationships out. For instance, it's already possible to write a program that will retrieve a set of DOIs from DataCite, then pull out all the ORCID IDs from those DOIs, and then search each of those manually for additional works. But that's a lot of code, and you'd have to wade through a bunch of information you don't want. To solve this, we've developed the DataCite GraphQL API. This API uses the GraphQL query language, which was originally developed at Facebook specifically to handle making queries across a graph of interconnected objects. With GraphQL, you can specify exactly the information you want and exactly how you want to receive it. And searching dataset DOIs to get ORCID IDs to then get article DOIs becomes a single query rather than a complex string of queries and manual filtering. While the PID graph in our GraphQL API greatly reduces the amount of developer effort needed, some developer know-how is still required, for now. But by the end of the FREYA project in late 2020, we will have also developed the common DOI search, allowing you to look up a DOI regardless of where it lives, and to swiftly and easily retrieve the metadata and relationships of that DOI. All powered by the DataCite GraphQL API and brought to you by the FREYA PID graph.